It's funny, sometimes we in the church are guilty, I think, of being in an ivory tower, so to speak. You know, we come in here on Sunday morning and rattle off a bunch of platitudes and then expect you to go out and live it on Monday and Tuesday, where in the world of traffic and job demands and financial demands and schedules and all of these other things. And sometimes that idealism doesn't always translate. And sometimes it's difficult for us to take a lot of the spiritual things that we're learning or that we're aspiring to, and it's like there's this whole other world out there. And sometimes we in the church are guilty of it, just kind of this big spiritual bubble, this culture bubble that we're in. And then when we get out of it, all of a sudden things are a little bit different. And this morning, I want to really try and identify that a little bit. And I want to talk about worry and stress and anxiety. And I'm going to kind of combine all of those concepts because in the scriptures, in the text we're going to be looking at today, the Greek word for worry kind of combines those concepts. And so we'll be using them interchangeably. And I had always been taught that worry was a sin. That it meant that you didn't trust God with your circumstances. It meant that you don't have enough faith, and that's why Jesus teaches against worry. But like I said, I want to get real here for a moment. Is like all worry or all anxiety or all stress is it all really a sin? Like, what happens if you lose your job and then you don't have any income and you don't know how you're going to make ends meet? Is it okay to worry about that? Or what if you go to the doctor and then he brings up the C word, right? And now you have to deal with cancer. Is it okay to stress or have a little bit of anxiety about that? Or what if someone you love, like a child or a spouse, is going to be traveling in a dangerous part of the world? Is that something that you can even help, not worrying about? Are we supposed to just roll with some things and not even give them a second thought? Is it even possible at times not to experience worry and anxiety and stress? Is it something that you can just turn on and turn off? Is it even a choice? Because, my understanding of sin is that it is typically a deliberate disobedience, towards God. And I would never choose stress. I would never choose worry and anxiety because they're horrible. They're absolutely horrible. In fact, they usually happen without my consent. In fact, worry, stress, and anxiety typically happen in spite of my non-consent. And didn't Jesus experience anxiety at times or stress at times? Like when he would pull away to pray because he was seeking strength and rest and perspective from having to deal with all of the crowds and the religious leaders and the pressures and the expectations and the temptations that came with just being Jesus, with just being who he was. And was it not anxiety that caused him to sweat blood at Gethsemane? We look at that and say, well, that's only the human response. You say, well, Jesus was divine, but he was also human. How can he not feel that? How can he not, struggle with that? And then yet, here's Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount telling us not to worry. And so what exactly does he mean by that? And what does that have to do with the kingdom of God? Because again, we're in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus is teaching us how to live in the kingdom, how to be citizens of the kingdom. And people will say, this is some of Jesus's, most lofty and inspirational teaching. And then right here in the middle of all of these very high-minded things, he just breaks out into this talk, this teaching about a very mundane or seemingly very mundane subject, worry and stress and anxiety. So let's take a look at that. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 25. And Jesus says, "Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more important than food, and the body more important than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? And who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to his life? And why do you worry about clothes? See how the lilies of the field grow? They do not labor or spin, yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." Okay, so what does all of this have to do with the kingdom and living in the kingdom? Well, Jesus tells us in verse 33. But I want to take a moment and backfill and give us some perspective as we lead up to verse 33. And the first thing we see here in this particular passage is that worry is a natural part of the human experience. Jesus assumes here that his hearers struggle with worry and anxiety and stress. And at one point, he just straight up says, he just, as a matter of fact, he makes this statement, "Why do you worry?" assuming that they all worry. And that's the tone here. That's the context here, is that Jesus assumes that these are universal problems and needs, that everybody has, that everybody's struggling with this. So that's where we live. That's real life today. But let me ask you a question. Is there worry? Is there stress? Is there anxiety in heaven? Well, we think, no. Absolutely not. Well, why not? Well, because in heaven, we know that God provides for all of our needs. So we don't have to worry about these things. Okay, well, was there worry and stress and anxiety in the Garden of Eden? Well, no. Why not? Well, the same thing. Adam and Eve had absolute trust in God that he would meet all of their needs. So what happened? Sin happened. And Adam and Eve got thrown out of the garden, which, as we've talked about, is much more than a place. It's a state of perfect relationship with God, where he provides for all of our needs. And then we get kicked out of the garden, and so now we have to fend for ourselves. Before, we didn't have to think about what we would eat or drink or what we would wear or what we would drive or how much money we make. We didn't have to worry about any of those things. And Adam and Eve didn't have to worry about them. You say, well, they didn't even know they were naked. Maybe they had clothes, maybe they didn't. They didn't know, they didn't care. That's the point. They didn't even think about it. God just provided these things. Now, all of a sudden we have to deal with real life. All of a sudden, we as a people, we need to deal with the realities and the dangers and the problems of this world. What happens if I don't get my crops in on time? What happens if the rains don't come? What happens if the locusts come and eat all my crops? What happens if wolves or other predators come and eat my flocks? What happens if my neighbors don't like me, or they want my land, or they want something that I have, and so they attack me, or they come to war with me? And there's nothing necessarily sinful without thinking, about thinking any of these thoughts. These are just simply the realities of the world as it exists outside of Eden. And so we live in a fallen world. And because we live in a fallen world, now all of a sudden we have all of these different concerns that have to do with the dangers and the problems and all of the stuff that's out there. And so we very naturally, at times, feel worry. We feel stress. We may even feel afraid at times. For example, my oldest daughter, Amanda, is quite an outdoors person. And she spent several summers in national parks, and including a couple of summers in Yosemite. And one day, her and a friend, when they were in Yosemite, she and a friend, decided that they were going to go on a day hike to the top of this mountain, but it was a very aggressive hike. And the day got away from her, and it took longer than she thought it was going to take. And by the time they started to head back down, it was dark. And because it was dark, they missed the trail going back to where they were supposed to go, to where they were staying, and instead they headed out into the deep wilderness. After a while, they realized that they were lost and unprepared. When I say unprepared, it freezes at night, and they were in shorts and a t-shirt. And every year, people get lost out there in the backcountry, unprepared, and die because of exposure and things like that. And so they decided that they would turn around and go back up the mountain and try and find the trail that they were supposed to take so they can go back to their lodgings where they were staying. However, when they turned around, right there on the trail, about 20 yards away where they had just walked, were these two huge glowing eyes and the faint outline of a mountain lion. And so they're like, okay, we can't go back up the trail because we don't want to go through the mountain lion. And so they made a decision to try and evade the mountain lion by working their way down the mountain, deeper into the wilderness, to try and get away from this mountain lion who is now stalking them in the middle of the night. And this went on for minute after excruciating minute, hour after excruciating hour. They would go for an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours. Have we seen the mountain lion in a while? No. And then all of a sudden, there it is. There's that outline again. They went through almost the entire evening, or really through the entire evening, but almost the entire evening, still seeing the mountain lion on numerous occasions. By the time they evaded the mountain lion, it's like 5 or 6 in the morning. They're freezing to death. They have absolutely no idea where they are. They're stuck out in the wilderness, and they still don't know if that mountain lion's out there or not. Amanda said, "Dad, I have never been so afraid in my entire life." And so let me ask you this. If you're lost in the Sierras, freezing, and being stalked by a mountain lion, is it okay to experience anxiety? Is it okay to worry? Is it okay to experience stress? I mean, they could have died in at least 3 ways. It's like Christ at Gethsemane. How could he not? How can he not feel that way? Or again, like when the doctor tells you you have cancer, or you lose your job, or what if you're being followed by two shady guys in a sketchy part of town and there's no one else around you? You know, sometimes it seems that worry and stress and anxiety, are the only natural thing to do. To not feel that way would be unnatural. Or do we just don't eat? Oh, well, God says not to worry, so I'm just not even going to give it another thought. And at the same time, the scriptures talk about wisdom. And they talk about this word prudence, which, when you start breaking the words down, are very much akin to worry and anxiety. In fact, there's an entire book of the Bible, Proverbs, which teaches us how to be wise with the various concerns of life. And so I guess what I'm saying is that this worry discussion, this anxiety discussion, this stress discussion is a little more complicated than just saying, well, we're just going to trust God and everything's going to work out. We're just going to go all Pollyanna on our problems. It's just not how it works. Picking on my daughter, Amanda, I don't know if I've mentioned her up here in a couple of years, but she was engaged to be married a few years back to a very nice Christian boy that we liked an awful lot. And the engagement ended up being cut off over what I would consider theological grounds. My daughter, Amanda, is as a firstborn, she's hyper responsible. And the entire time that she was in school, although she was in school like almost 6 years, but the entire time that she was in school, she worked pretty much a full-time job. She worked 30 plus hours a week because she was determined not to have any debt. And so she didn't have the same school experience that everyone else did because she was always working, because she's trying to do the right thing. She's trying to be responsible. When she gets out of school, she's going to have a degree and she's not going to have any debt like the rest of these slobs. That's the way she thinks, right? And her fiance was also a student and dirt poor. I mean, poor as anything. Didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. And so he would come over and he would have, McDonald's or concert tickets or, just one thing or another. And she would say, well, hey, where did you get the money to buy that? And he would just very casually say, oh, I took out another student loan. And she would correct him and say, well, you mean to say we just took out another student loan? Because when we get married, your debts become my debts, and I don't believe that we should be taking student loans to pay for things like McDonald's and and concert tickets and stuff. And here's his response. This is what I mean when I say theological grounds. She would say, you need to lighten up. He would say, you need to lighten up and just trust God. You need to have more faith than that. I believe that Proverbs agrees with Amanda. And that these were very legitimate concerns on her part. Now, I guess what I'm trying to say is because these are concerns on her part, maybe even important things or legitimate things for her to worry about, is that there's a very thin line between a legitimate concern and worrying about something. There's a very thin line between a legitimate concern and starting to stress about something. And it's a line that all of us have crossed at one time or another. That's what I mean when I say that worry, stress, anxiety are part of the, a natural part of the human experience. And that's what Jesus meant when he said, why do you worry? When he makes the assumption that they're worrying. But here's another thing that Jesus knew And I think we know this as well, but it's important for us to talk about it. And that is that worry, stress, anxiety are also a negative part of the human experience. Jesus talks about this at several points. In verse 27, he says, "Who of you by worrying can add a single hour to your life?" Verse 34, "Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." He's saying that, that worry doesn't do any good. And worry may be very natural for us because we live in a fallen world. And bad things happen to good people. And here's something that blows some people's theology right out of the water. But listen, bad things happen to good Christians. And we cannot insulate ourselves from all of the problems of this world. Nor are we supposed to be insulated from all of the problems of this world. And so a lot of people sit around and worry about all of these things that we have absolutely no control over. And what Jesus is saying is that, obsessing over all of these things is futile. It doesn't do any good. In fact, sometimes it makes things worse. In fact, sometimes it makes them far worse. The American Medical Association has listed stress and worry as one of the leading health issues in America today. And in their material, they list all sorts of problems associated with stress. Our bodies, for example, they say internalize stress, especially our hearts. Stress takes years off your life. They say people who live stressed out lives live shorter lifespans. Stress causes insomnia. Stress causes irritability. Stress destroys peace and joy. Stress sometimes even causes paranoia, and it causes some people to obsess on their problems and ignore other factors in life. Now, I know all this. I read it intellectually, I process it, I agree with it, I know it, I can recite it back to you. And yet stress still plays a major role in my life. Some of you probably know that I struggle with insomnia. Have since I was a child. I can remember 8, 9, 10 years old, not being able to go to sleep. And I come by it honestly because both of my parents also struggle with insomnia. And one of the things that I've noticed over the years is that my insomnia tends to, and not always, but it tends to be worse, or it tends to cycle along with periods of stress in my life. And when this is happening, I can just feel it in my body. I can feel it, building up. And I'll go to bed, and I'm trying to go to sleep, and there's nothing in the world at this moment that I want more than to go to sleep. And my brain just won't turn off. And I absolutely hate it. And I'll go to sleep, and I have this whole routine because I've read up on it, I've studied on it, I've researched it, I've done all the things I'm supposed to do, and I'll go to bed and I'll lay there for an hour or two, and pretty soon it's midnight, and then it's 2 o'clock, and then it's 4 o'clock. I would say on average, every month there's probably 2 to 3 nights where I don't sleep at all. I'll go all the way to the next morning, and on several occasions, I've actually made it 3 days without sleeping. And I get so absolutely frustrated. And it just works me up even more. It cycles on itself and makes itself worse. And one of the things that's so horrible about it is it just messes with my mind because I can't think. My mind doesn't work properly, and it makes it so difficult for me to do my job. It's almost impossible for me to sit down and write and mentally work through writing a message. And then to come up here and to preach and speak. And there are days when I came up here earlier and I talked about by grace. There are days when I have absolutely no idea how I make it through delivering a message. Absolutely none. All I can say is by grace. And I forget things. I become irritable. I become cranky. I'm just not myself. And I know, again, that sometimes, this is associated with stress. And so I work really hard to try to work stress out of my life, to try to alleviate as much stress as I can. And sometimes, I can do that. And I think that, for the most part, I've been able to minimize that. And I really try to take a lot of the scriptures to heart and all of those sorts of things. But there are times that regardless of what I do, I just can't turn it off. And it's just there. And so, stress, worry, you can just see how it just messes with you and gets in your head. Stress and worry likewise, not necessarily from an internal perspective, but in how we relate to the world, it changes things. It causes us to become very negative and very pessimistic in how we even relate to the world. Pessimistic people have this way of perpetuating their own gloomy outlook on life. Negativity becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. One of my favorite all-time stories involves a father with two sons. The older son was the consummate cynic, and he was negative and pessimistic, and he always saw the negative, dark side of absolutely everything. And yet his younger son was exactly the opposite, and he was the excessive optimist. And no matter what happened, he saw sunshine and rainbows, and everything was always great. In every situation, he saw the best in every part about it. And so the father decided that his older son was too dark, and his younger son was too naive. And he was going to try and deal with this and address this one Christmas. And so at this particular Christmas, he buys the older son a pony, thinking, man, there's no way he could possibly find fault with a pony. The younger son, he buys a huge pile of manure. And he thinks there is no way he could possibly find anything good, anything positive about a huge pile of manure. So Christmas morning comes around. And he takes them out back and he brings them out there and he shows them their gifts. And the older son takes one look at that pony and immediately he begins to weep. And he starts to whine and he says, oh my goodness, this pony, this is just such a great pony. And I just know that soon something bad is going to happen to this pony and it's going to die. And life is just setting me up for this huge disappointment. The younger son sees the big pile of manure, jumps for joy, grabs a shovel, and just starts working through that manure, whistling a happy tune. And the father says, son, why are you so happy? And he says, Dad, with a pile of manure this big, there has got to be a great pony in there somewhere. Now, of course, the younger son is in for a big surprise, but let me ask you a question. You know these two dispositions. They're not always fictitious. We know people that live this way, don't we? Which one's happier? Which one's more fulfilled, more satisfied with life? Is it not the younger son? And then let me ask you this. Is not the older son's disposition, his cynicism, his negativity, is that not caused by just excessive worry and stress and anxiety? And the older son's disposition, or the younger son's disposition, is that not caused by a sense of faith and inherent trust in life, in God, and whatever? That's where Jesus is going with this. And so we see that worry and stress and anxiety, yes, they're a natural part of life. They're a natural part of the fall. And that stress and worry and anxiety are a negative part of the human experience. They're one of those casualties of the fall that we have to deal with. And just about all of us, in one way or another, we have to deal with that and deal with anxiety and deal with worry and deal with stress. However, faith should be a natural part of the human experience. More specifically, faith in God. And that is how we are supposed to relate to the world. We were created for faith. Again, more specifically, we were created for faith in God. And this is where the kingdom factors in. The reason there's no worry or stress in heaven is because the kingdom exists in all of its glorious perfection. In heaven, we have absolute trust in God that He is going to provide far beyond anything that we can possibly imagine. Heaven is a place of unquenchable faith in God. Likewise, the reason there's no worry and stress in the garden is because God's will is done there as well. And Adam and Eve don't worry about anything because God has always provided for them, and they know that He is going to always provide. Now, here's where it all comes together. The Sermon on the Mount is about restoring the kingdom. Jesus is teaching His followers what it is to live in the kingdom. And again, the kingdom is as much a state as it is a place. And the kingdom is where God is king. And so living in the kingdom, which, as we've already established in prior messages, is something that we can do now. And so living in the kingdom is living in faith and trust in God. And the more faith and trust, the closer we move to the kingdom, and the more we experience the benefits of the kingdom, among which are peace and tranquility and harmony and that sense of rest that we gain in God. It's also no coincidence, I believe, that this teaching is right on the heels and in the context of what we talked about last week when Jesus talked about money. And He talked about laying up treasures in heaven rather than the material things on earth. And instead of seeking the material and the temporal, that we should set our minds on the eternal and the spiritual. And so here, Jesus is almost casually, the tone of the text has always caused me to kind of wonder and kind of muse, what's going on here? Because He's almost poo-pooing our natural needs. Don't worry about what you'll eat. Don't worry about what you wear. Don't worry about what you drink. God will provide those things. I mean, it's just kind of this offhanded kind of a tone to all of that. And it's not that those things are not important. It's that there are other things that are more important. And what He's saying is, when we seek the kingdom, when we seek His righteousness, life takes on a whole new dimension, a whole new fullness, a whole new richness, a whole new level of satisfaction and happiness than when we are simply living according to what we're going to eat and what we're going to wear and what we drive and how much money we have. Jesus is teaching us about perspective. He's teaching us about faith. He's asking important questions about reality and life. And He's asking, do you really believe that there's more to this life than this? What, just right here, what we can see, what we can touch. Do you really believe there's more to this life than the material world? Because if you don't believe that, then you're going to be all about what we eat, what we wear, what we drive, what we spend. That's going to be the totality of your worldview because that's all you have. But if you believe that there's more to this life than what we can see and what we can touch, then we will seek higher things. Or at least we have the ability or the capacity then at that point to seek the higher things. Seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. He's saying that there's a higher way for us to exist, a better way for us to exist, and that is in the kingdom, and that is living in trust and faith and relationship with God. And as we live in trust with Him, these other things take on a whole new significance, and now these other things aren't nearly as important as they used to be. It changes us. Again, it's not that clothes or food or any of that stuff isn't important. It is important. We need those things to live. And that's what Jesus is saying. Is that not the spirit, the tone of what's going on here? Yeah, your Father knows you need that stuff. But the kingdom, that's where it's at. Seeking God and learning to trust Him and looking to these other things. And when you look to those things, Jesus begins to give you those things. God begins to give you the things of the kingdom, the treasures of the kingdom, if you will. Lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. All of those things that we talked about of the kingdom now become ours. And again, these other things aren't nearly as important as they used to be. It's all about perspective. It's all about faith. It's about how we approach life, how we approach God. That's what it is to live in the kingdom of God. And so all of a sudden, this very mundane topic, it sounds like a TED Talk, stress or something, This is something that you get in the 26th chapter of your psychology textbook, your intro to psychology or something. It just seems very mundane. All of a sudden, Jesus just takes it and turns it inside out and shows us a whole new way to look at things that really changes the game. Now, as long as we live in a fallen world, there's going to be anxiety and stress and worry. We cannot help it. And this world can be a very unstable, fretful, and even scary place sometimes. And I know that God understands that. And if we're not careful, we take all of these worries and all of this anxiety and all of this stress, and then we begin to carry it in our souls. And now all of a sudden we have physical, we have relational, we have spiritual problems because of that. This is not how we were created to live. Again, this is caused from the fall. We were created to live in perfect trust in God. We were created to live in faith where God provides for us and provides all of our needs. So, we were created to live in peace and harmony. And God desires that we rise above the cares of this world, in a sense, making them secondary by embracing Him and His kingdom. This is the life of faith. And the life of faith, by definition, in seeking the higher things and prioritizing the higher things and making our entire lives about the higher things, releases us from so much of the baggage and the garbage that we carry around from the lower things. And the Bible talks about this a great deal in Philippians, the passage George read earlier. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. 1 Peter 5:7, cast all your anxiety on Him because He cares for you. The King James, I like the way they do the word play there. Cast your cares upon Him, for He cares for you. And it goes on. The Bible talks about this over and over and over again, and that is that we live in a different way. That's the challenge, though, isn't it? It's moving from the world of our problems and our anxieties and our cares to moving to that place of trust and that place of faith so it doesn't take us over. And I guess I go back to that initial thought that I brought up during the offering, and that is by grace. You know, we lean on the grace of God, and we look to Him and we trust in Him. Because stress, anxiety, worry, this is not how we're supposed to live. That's not supposed to eat us up. And we will experience true peace in heaven. When we go to heaven, I think it's going to be one of the greatest things about it. All the cares of this world are going to be absolutely gone. And we will live in perfect trust in God because He will provide for all of our needs. But what Jesus is saying, the whole point of the Sermon on the Mount, is that you can taste the kingdom now. You can experience the kingdom now. You can experience this dynamic in your life now as you begin to trust in Him and have faith in Him and look to those higher things. Again, it changes everything and turns it all inside out. And so I guess that's my challenge to us today. I guess it's just to recognize, you know, how the world just gets under our skin and how we allow it to get under our skin. And how at times we find ourselves prioritizing the wrong things and focusing on the wrong things, even when we don't realize it. It just happens. It's because we're human. And so today is really a call to be more intentional with life. It's a call to be intentional about the things we value. It's a call to be intentional about the things that we let get under our skin or not get under our skin. It's a call to the higher things. It's a call to trust and faith in a Father who loves us and desires kingdom living for us. It's a call to cast our cares upon Him and live life in that trusting father-child relationship that He desires, which is how His kingdom is designed.